feature presentation.
Jasmin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about Motherland. There's so much to discuss, and the first thing I wanted to ask, because this is a personal project and something that is, you're telling your father's story in a way. When did you decide it was time to tell this story because it was something that was so personal and familial?
I think during 2021, I started conceptualizing Motherland. I made a feature almost now like 8 or 9 years ago, and I went right from that feature into TV land, became like a TV director. And, I needed to do that because I needed to like make a living and have a career, but I felt very creatively starved. And I'd been writing a feature for a while, and I was like, I just need to make something that's my own now, like soon. And not to say short films are fast, because they're not, but it was faster than making a feature. So that was one reason why. But then also, I was thinking a lot about my father because he passed away 11 years ago now. And you go through all these stages of grief and like trying to find out about your dad. And him and I didn't have like a very close, like I saw him all the time, but we were not close. And so I think after he died, there was a curiosity about him a lot. And then also for me, because I'm half Iranian, I felt like I was at an arm's length from my culture, of that part of my culture. And I think as I was in my, moving into my 30s, I was like, I really want to get more in touch with this part of myself, my Iranian roots. And he always encouraged me to do that too. So I had started to explore that part of filmmaking. I had started writing a feature in 2020 that was about him, but it took place more in modern times. And then I thought, I don't know how I came across, I just thought about his time in 1979 in the US, and started asking my mom about that time. She didn't know him right at that time, but asking his brothers about that time. And I was like, there's something here. Um, and I really was on this mission, and still am, to kind of like reclaim Iranian stories, diaspora stories. Um, and kind of make them our own again, because they've been made in such kind of terrible ways by other people for so long. So all that kind of came together, and I started thinking about the hostage crisis. The first film I thought about was all in Farsi, and I was like, that's too daunting for a person who, I speak a little bit of Farsi, but not enough to direct an entire film in Farsi. So I changed it, made it kind of was like this love story. I thought about my mom more, and then I just started writing it um, between TV gigs. So that's kind of how it began.
Yeah, because you've talked before in interviews about how the process of Firecrackers was made, the feature version, where you would write and even think about edits or conceptualize it, on the TTC and moving around that way. So
Right.
it's really interesting in terms of how the process is of creating something that's so personal. Um, going back to your father, did you ever have a sit down or talk about that time in 1979? Because I believe he was in Massachusetts at that moment, right?
Yeah, he was. You know what? I didn't, and I regret it to this day, like that I never sat down and asked him about it. He did mention to me once, like anecdotally, he's like, "Oh, I used to live in Worcester, Massachusetts." And I was like, because I feel like a lot of Iranians can relate to this, especially if their parents are like boomers. It's something about that time and the trauma that they all went through has made them like not the most over, they don't share a lot, but it comes out in little spurts over the course of your life. And like he just mentioned that one day, and I was like, who are you? Like, what? I didn't know. And he's like, yeah, I like was trying to date this Italian girl, and like the mafia was after me. And like I'm like, that was my original story of the film, was like him with these dudes going to like discos in Massachusetts and whatever. But um I was like, that's all in Farsi, and I can't do it. But he said he moved there. He came over when he was like 19 or 18 or 19. I don't know the exact age. And then he went directly there because he had this like, my dad wasn't well off, but he had this rich Iranian friend who just like, they were all these like young dudes. They went there and they were just like, you know, going out, drinking, experiencing American life for the first time, dating girls. And that's when there was like this high. And then I think the hostage crisis happened and it was like a bubble burst for them. Their dreams kind of shifted. And I feel like they started to like disperse after that. And then, you know, not long after that, he went to Canada because his mom, my grandmother, called him and said, I don't think it's safe here for you. I don't think you're safe in the US. I think you should go to Canada. You have some family roots there. They also had been in Canada in the 60s in Quebec briefly. So he knew Canada and then he went. So, you know, I used parts of that in the film, you know, like even his mom calling him and saying, you know, your Dai Reza, which is your Uncle Reza, is in Canada. You should go there. Like part of that was extracted from reality. So I knew a little bit of that. And I think making Bobak as a character, my dad also was named Bobak, is my dad was not, there was a part of my dad I didn't know. This like kind of like rebellious, swaggery guy that I never knew. But I was like, that's kind of interesting. So I made that's the version of the character I made in the film, was that part of my dad I never knew. So yeah, that's all he really said. And then I dug it out of his brothers. His brothers said to me, you know, your dad actually did get beat up by American dudes at a bar once during that time. And I was like, you know, there's all this backstory I was writing for the characters, and some of this backstory ended up being true. Like one of my uncles was protesting in Iran, maybe not by the embassy, but he was like socialist, and you know, like he was a part of this revolution of all these Iranians who thought, you know, down with the Shah, we're going to be, there's a better Iran coming, and obviously they found out that wasn't true, but I'd written that as a backstory for his character with his brother, and it ended up being true. Like after I made the film, my uncle Beiruz just said, "Oh yeah, actually I was a little bit of a political person." I was like, weird, because I wrote that in the movie. And his pictures in the movie too, when he looks at a picture of his brother, it's actually my grandmother and my uncle. So
I was
it's
going to ask about that because the
yeah.
insert shot at the beginning when he's holding that photo, I was curious if that was something that was also personal, because you've even talked about even like, you know, the Bruce Lee poster being something that your dad really loved. And I was curious about this because there was something that Steven Spielberg said when he was presenting The Fabelmans, and he said part of the reason why he made that movie was so he could see his parents again. Was that something that you saw in not only the performance but in the character coming to life? Did you see your father, you know, coming in this sort of new kind of cinematic way?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful quote and like sentiment. I think that's true. And it's what's interesting is I found it more in the writing to be true. Um I'm sorry, my cat
No,
is
it's okay.
let me move him so he's not
Yeah, sure.
making noise. Okay, one second. Okay, I think more in the writing that was true because I felt like I was getting closer to my dad through the writing of the project. But it was interesting in the making of it because with Betosh, who played my father, uh, he was really gung-ho about playing my father, but he was hung up on, I want to make sure I'm portraying your father correctly. I want to make sure. And then at a certain point, I said, I don't think this is necessary. I think him and I both needed to let go of this idea of that this character's my dad. It was you're inspired by my dad, but this character's actually not my father anymore. It's now your creation. And once we let go of that, we felt, I think there was a freedom on set. There was a freedom in the making of it, like the filming of it. And I realized that when you're making films about people you know, I think you have to kind of let go of that idea of them at a certain point and just say these are new characters now. So I did that with my mom's character and my dad's character. And then the picture is actually it's his younger brother named Beiruz and my grandma who's actually named Iran after the country, which is like even more symbolic. But I had to ask my uncle for permission. Can I use this picture of you? At first, he said no, because he's like, I don't know. They're always so paranoid. Something's going to be, they're still living this paranoia of like, I don't want our story on screen because what if it links back to like something? And I'm like, it won't, but fair enough. And then later he texted me and said, no, you can use it. I just, I think I look really angry in that picture because I wasn't, I was unhappy with where I was in my life at that time. I felt trapped in Iran, and that expression on my face is from that feeling of all like the political situation, everything weighing down on me, and that I had to be in Iran at that time. And I thought, even better. Like, I mean, that's only a story I know, but I think it was interesting to bring real life elements of my family into the movie, but also keep a distance so that I could have, because when you get too close to something, you lose an objectivity as a director, or you might miss things. It might not be as good as you think it is because you're too attached. So I think you have to kind of pull away at a certain point.
Yeah, there's an importance in terms of separation from the story you're telling, the narrative you're telling, but also it's still being universal in a way. Because the other thing that I found fascinating and learning about the film is that Betesh has a story that's not dissimilar in terms of his own, background. Was that something that he was open to talking to you about right away, or was that something that you found out over time?
In 2021, I'd gone to Vancouver to shoot a Netflix show. And while I was there, I went to meet with Betosh because I'd seen him in one of my friend's films called Sahar that played at TIFF a long time ago. It was a short film. And I thought he was a fantastic actor. He was very, different character in that film. But I was like, I feel like that's the person to play Bobak. And then I started kind of writing with him in mind. And at the end of 2021 in September, I went to Vancouver to shoot and I met him. We went for a hike in Lynn Valley, like this really beautiful area of Vancouver. And as we were on this hike, he just opened up to me about his life. And I didn't even say to him, it's not like I went there to say, I actually just wanted to meet him. I didn't say, I have a film I'm writing with you in mind. I didn't say any of that. Actually, I kept that because I was like, let's see. And as we were walking, it just like, it was crazy, his parallels. And he was, he said, I grew up kind of away from my father. We were in Iran and then we had to leave. We kind of had to escape as refugees when he was like young. I think he was like 8 or something. And they, it was a different time. I think it was the 90s versus when my dad left, but they like went to Europe and then they came to Canada. And he has a younger brother and just a lot of these like similar feelings of being an immigrant in North America, I think mirrored my dad, but the difference is Betosh has gone to therapy and like is very good at communicating the emotional feelings around being an immigrant, around being a Middle Eastern immigrant, assimilation. He understood the layers to that. And then also being an actor as a Middle Eastern actor, having to go through all that is a whole other story. So there was so much he could relate to. And then after that walk, I think I mentioned, I am writing this like film. I'd love to share it with you when it's done. And then I did, I think in 2022, I did. So and then even crazier, like I was with him. I'd gone back to Vancouver in 2022 because I have a lot of friends there and we were all hanging out and Betosh was there. We were swimming in a river and I got like an email from uh Ontario Arts Council, which was the last piece of funding I was waiting for. And I was with Betosh when we kind of found out that we got the full funding for the short. So it was like it was very meant to be with him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's I mean it's an amazing performance, and obviously the bookending of the phone calls really hits you in a way that you're not expecting. But even the little moments after the conversation with Werner in the field where he's sitting and having the cigarette, and you can almost feel the cool night air almost on him, and hitting him in a way where it's like it's chilling, but he needs that moment to not go back inside. Like it's all there and it all feels so internalized in that way. I know this is a very simple question, but why did you make Motherland a short and not a feature? Because it feels like this could be a feature film.
I have I'm not a great shorts filmmaker. I'll say that right now because I cannot make a short for the to save my life. Like I just can't. I'm so long-winded. I feel like even my next feature is going to be yeah, this is like an issue I have as a filmmaker. Um I think there was the part of me that, like I said before, I just wanted to make something quicker. Making a feature is such a long process, and I think especially with a second feature, I'm becoming aware that the process of that's going to be even more complicated than a first feature that was made with a micro budget where I had all the control. I want to make something bigger and I need, we're gonna have to get all this funding. And I was like, I just don't want to do that with this. So I wanted to make something sooner. The other reason was I was trying a new style for myself. I was trying something a little bit more formal, I think, in the way of like the how I used framing, how I used how I directed actors. I was trying something a little new. And sometimes it's nice to do that with a short rather than jump into a feature and try that. Because with Firecrackers, it was extremely loose camera work. It was more like in the Andrew Arnold vein of filmmaking, this kind of very loose style, which I still love, but I think I'm not going to go back to that anymore. And I wanted to try something that was more locked off, formal. I think like you talked about, to me, the shot that signifies a big change for me as a filmmaker is that outdoor shot that pans from the sky and lands on Bob Axe smoking, and in the background, Katie emerges from the door and joins him. It's not a shot I ever would have done as a younger filmmaker. I think I would have been close in with the camera into his face. I would have wanted to cut to Katie, be with her, bring her down with the camera. And I think I said, you know what? Let's let the audience decide where to look a little bit more. Let's give them more agency. So I think that's why I wanted to try short first. And then after I made the short, I kind of felt like satisfied. Like I don't want to make it a feature anymore. I'm also kind of exhausted of making straight dramas. I kind of want to bend genres a bit and move. I like to kind of I think I get a little bit like I'm a filmmaker who wants to try almost a new thing every time, which I don't know if is a good thing, but because you kind of, what's your brand? Who knows?
I think that is a good thing though, because
Yeah.
it gives you the sense of like I think a great filmmaker, you mentioned Andrea Arnold actually, which I just did an interview just right before this for Bird. There's an aspect of the movie continues to change and you never feel like it's just one movie. And you can't predict where it's going even until the end credits. And watching Firecrackers and this, you do feel like there is a change in authorship from your perspective, even the visual point of view. I was curious, was the decision to shoot on 16 millimeter film something that you wanted to do right away, and was there a degree of difficulty getting that? Because aesthetically it makes so much sense, not only because it's a period piece, but it feels like it's alive and there's texture to it. Even the imperfections have perfections in them.
Yeah, I think like a lot of filmmakers, you kind of wish you could shoot every project on film. I think Firecrackers, I wanted to shoot on film, but I knew I was working with very, very inexperienced or non-actors. And I was like, there's no way. I need digital because I need to be able to do as many takes necessary and give the actors the freedom to perform without being like, we only have 2 minutes left in the mag. Um, so like, to be honest, I feel like all my films would be shot on film if I could. But since that's not possible, like Firecrackers, and I honestly, I don't regret that decision at all with Firecrackers. I think digital actually is a very nice medium now. With Motherland, I realized too as a filmmaker when you're talking to producers early on, and you just kind of have to like take a stance with film and be like, it is going to be shot on film. So we need to make that happen. Because if you're like, it could be or not, then you will always lose it because the budget will, it won't be protected by the producers when they're like redoing the budget. So I was like, this has to be film because it's 1979. And the goal with this going into it was always this needs to feel like a film you're watching from that era, not an imitation of, not like because the 70s is hard. It can look a little wacky if you don't get it right. So like we were very, and I say we, I mean me, the producers, Farhad, who's the DP, and Mara Ziegler, who's the costume designer, Helen, who was the production designer. I was like, we all need to be on the same page of this is not like like a Halloween costume vibe. Like we're doing 70s for real. And none of us lived through the 70s. So we had to really research, understand it. And I was like, it needs to be on that. To be honest, I kind of wish we shot 35 millimeter, but the expense of that, the expense of making a period piece correctly in general is astronomical for us. The cost of this film cost as much as firecrackers to make this film.
Wow.
And it's short. Yeah. Sadly.
I mean, thinking about that, that's astonishing because yeah, it's one thing where you don't realize because I mean, when film was used for everything, it was just the norm.
Yeah.
But now digital obviously is cheaper and you can have that sort of, you can look at what you're shooting right away. But what you were saying before, I think is really important because, if you shoot it wrong, not only is it going to be out of focus, but there is that feeling of like, or are you watching, a costume play or something like a dinner theater in a way, and it doesn't feel authentic or an artifact of the time anymore.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, so many focus pullers don't pull for film anymore. So we had a very experienced focus puller who I've worked with on almost all my films. But there is some moments that go totally out of focus. And there was one moment when Katie's crying. I feel settled about it now, but I was pretty upset when I saw the rushes because I said to the focus pull, I said to everybody, I said, I think we're only going to get one true take of this cry that feels real. Because some actors, I think, can cry and cry and cry. And then other ones, you got one or two, maybe, where it feels real and not forced. And I felt like with Oriana, who's a great actress, she told me, she's like, I don't really cry. Like, it's not something I've done a lot. And I was like, okay, that's fine. We'll work towards it. But I told the crew, I said, we got one. And the one we got it went out of focus. The motor, something with the motor happened, and it's in the film, out of focus. And it's just something I had to I feel like in that moment, it's slightly okay because of the emotion of that. It can I can maybe get away with it, or maybe I'm just a filmmaker trying to justify a mistake. But some people have come up to me and been like, well, I love when it goes out of focus there. And I was like, it was a mistake. It was a mistake. So it's interesting just because there's so few people that work with film now that even the technical part is a risk. But I think overall, I love period pieces in general. I love period pieces that speak to something about modern times through the past. And I was like, it just needs to feel like this is the 70s. This is not 2022 or whatever when we were shooting it, looking back. So all the costumes were from 1970. They were not modern day things. They were rented. They were preserved from that time. And the same with the film. I think 35 would have been amazing, but because 16 is more gritty and it's grainy, and I think it works, but I still think 35 is like the ideal.
Yeah, it still adds texture though. Like there's a great texture to it that I think brings an authenticity and like you're talking about the costumes, like they don't feel or look completely new either. Like they feel like they've been worn before, the characters have worn them before. And I think that's a really important aspect of the film as well, where everything feels, obviously the terms used a lot, but lived in that way. So
exactly. I think the costume designer, because she did Firecrackers too, Mara, the way she thinks about characters and their costumes is very special to me. And same with the production design. It's like we always talked about, the production design is like, yeah, it's 1979, but it's probably there's stuff from the 60s here. The people, when they're wearing, some of the older people in the dancing sequence of the Thanksgiving dance are older. And I'm like, and even Ruth, who is Katie's mom, who we see, we kind of thought about her as somebody who's maybe stuck in the late 60s a bit, like her beehive hair is still there. You know, she's wearing like a piece of jewelry that she's probably had for 10 years or more. So we were very much trying to think about all those little details. And it's interesting because sometimes we do fittings and people would come out in a costume and it looked like, we're like, whoa, that looks like a lot. And Mara would be like, but this is what they wore. It looks weird, but this is what. So we had to find a middle ground to be like, what can our modern day eye accept as like 70s, but also be authentic at the same time. And then also commit to the whole color palette that we were deciding on. And what should Katie wear? What does this say about her? She's a little bit, Katie, like, and I told my mom, I said, you're a little naive at this time in your life. You're a grown woman, but you're a little bit childish. So that was a little bit put into her, like she was wearing like a peasant dress, her hair was down. She had a little bit of like a young girl mentality, so that was woven into her costume in a subtle way, like. And I love costuming and makeup and saying, okay, this is what type of person they are, so why are they wearing a beehive, like, and like, why is Werner's hat black and not brown? Why is it, like, every detail for me always needs to be attributed to a reason, like every line, every movement, everything like that. So it was really, really fun to make the film because of that.
Absolutely. And it gives character development too, because you don't necessarily have to have exposition to tell a character's story. The wardrobe, the way they hold themselves, the movement of the characters, how they say certain lines. It's all there in the dialogue. And it feels economic in that way as well. And I think like that's an important thing where you get across the point that's important in this story. And you've talked a little bit before about a movie like Argo being something that is kind of like what people think of this particular time in history, and trying to dismantle that a little bit. And I was curious to ask you, do you think Western portrayals of Middle Eastern cultures have become any more progressive since 1979? And why has it stayed so long in terms of like, it feels like it's been frozen in time in some ways?
I think you're exactly right. It's been frozen in time. I don't really see a progression that much. I think the progression is through other Persian people in the diaspora making their own films like the Persian version, that have come out more recently. It's made by an Iranian person who lived in New York and came up, and it's a whole different genre, like comedy, more comedy and lighter. Um, but yeah, like these films of House of Sand and Fog, Argo, um, these ones are incredibly damning portrayals. I watched like there's some TV shows that show like Iranian people in it. There was one I think Apple made called Little America, and there was an Iranian episode, and I still felt that it didn't feel authentic in some way. There was some parts that were, but there's always this sanitation. It always feels like with Middle Eastern stories, it feels like it has to be, we got to make them funny or happy, so like we're not edging on the political anything. But the reality is, as a Middle Eastern person, your body is inherently a political body. You cannot escape that. So to erase that part of your existence, to me, always feels inauthentic because you cannot escape it. For instance, like, even though I'm only half Iranian, I grew up in the post 9/11 era, and when I grew up in a place called Barrie, um and still, in Canada it was different, but it was, in small communities that don't have much diversity, you are looked at because of the way media portrays you. And this was the same thing with the hostage crisis. This is kind of where it began for Iranian people, and also for Middle Eastern people, I think more broadly, was the narrative. How is the narrative being shaped? And I think because the narrative through politics, through news, has not really changed over time about Middle Eastern people, you see that Hollywood mirrors that. Or it's either they mirror that because all Middle Eastern people are playing like Iranian actors will play Arab people, they'll play Italian people. It just like doesn't make sense. Um, and then or they'll sanitize it and be like, let's just talk about Persian rugs and Hormasabzi and like, the music, which are all beautiful parts of our culture. But I don't think you can also run away from the fact that our bodies are political. We can't escape that. Like we live in this world. So I think that what I want to do is like bring humanity back to our stories, but also not shy away from the fact that um there's going to be some slight political touch points in my films, because every time I get together with my family, like we are my Persian family, even if it's like a Thanksgiving dinner or like Nowruz, which is Persian New Year, it always comes up like what's happening in Iran, what's happening in the Middle East. It's a part of who we are. So it's um and I don't think Hollywood's ready to breach that. There's a fear. There's a huge fear there. So we'll see what happens as more and more Iranian people make films. Like after Firecrackers, I was sent scripts from, my agents in LA, and a lot of them were like, "Oh, there's a Iranian girl with a hijab, and then at the end she takes it off and she's liberated." And I was like, "I'm not doing this." Um, and that's kind of the stories they want to make right now. And I'm like, I'm not down to do that.
Yeah, well, it's such a like people are so complicated, and you need to have the I guess the confrontational aspects as well as the good and the bad and all of that, and actually have a conversation and listen to what's going on. And I was going to ask the same question in terms of even in Canada, because I've noticed that there are more filmmakers that are taking back their stories, whether it be someone like Tracy Deer for Beans, or Meredith Hama Brown, who's made, I think, one of the best movies of the year with Seagrass. And it feels like maybe there's this movement in Canada where stories are going back to, the authors that tell them, and not just simply being made as digestible content, or simply, pandering.
Yeah, those two examples are made. I love Beans and Seagrass, and they're different way. I mean, like Beans, of course, there is a political and aspect to it, and because you cannot really shed that and just look at parts of indigenous culture without talking about the sort of darker parts. And then you see Seagrass, or even like when I look at Korean American cinema, like a Minari, and like I really look to Asian American cinema as like um kind of like my heroes in a way, because they've really breached the Hollywood system, I think, without losing too much of their identity. Like even a show like Beef that is with all like Asian American cast, and it's not even really about the identity, but it also is about Asian identity. It's like woven into the narrative so well. And I hope that more and more cultures can take up space in the same way. I think we will be. I think Canada does probably is the most supportive of those voices, more than a Hollywood is, even more than Europe, I think, in a lot of ways. Canada is unafraid to support those kind of bold risk-taking voices, I think, a little bit more. And in this, even the fact that, I was surprised that Motherland won 2 Canadian Screen Awards. Um, I think that the film sometimes edges on a political, like I think that not every festival has felt comfortable programming it. So, like I think that, but I'm happy to see that in Canada there is some support for it, and obviously it won at TIFF as well, and I was shocked I didn't think that that would happen with this film. Um and it did. So I'm kind of proud of that, in the Canadian sense, that we have the balls to really be like, you know what, there's people saying stuff here, and we're going to support that. We're not afraid. And that excites me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's still, room to continue to grow as well, especially, on the TIFF side of things and how certain things are going right now, even with, Israel and Palestine. And like one of the best movies of the year hasn't even gotten distribution, No Other Land. And
My
to me,
God.
I don't know how that's possible, other than I guess the subject matter it's too controversial, quote unquote, for distributors. But it is like truly one of the great films of the year. And I just don't understand why that doesn't have distribution.
I see the issue being Hollywood a lot just because, Motherland is now in a different phase of its existence where we're like dealing more with LA and like the plans beyond Canada right now. And man, it's a different world in that on that side of things. I have a feeling that the resistance comes beyond the film. I mean, film festivals, there's resistance too, especially for Palestinian filmmakers. But I think that really where it starts to where there's a wall is Hollywood. And I think the distributors who exist there and they're just so fearful still. Um, and I'll never forget this, I'll never forget the people who I think kind of are like, well, it's not a good time for Iran. And uh, I'll never forget these people because I think they're on the wrong side of history. And I think that um, with time, hopefully there will be a change. I think there needs to be a new wave of execs who are, you know, more open-minded from different cultures. I think right now, like the people who hold a lot of power in these positions are very fear-based. I mean, distributors are always fear-based, but this kind of, like you said, like this amazing film being held back. Like art should question things. Art should be provocative. And I feel recently like we've kind of backed away from that. Um, and it's sad. I think we got to just keep pushing past that.
Yeah, and it should be accessible to everybody. Like I know a lot of people are talking this year with, the seed of the sacred fig. And I love it, but I also know that, Matthew Rankin is not Persian. So like something like universal language, it's
Yeah.
one of those things where like the conversation's there, but I think it needs to almost be, more current or frequent. Like it's not just like a one-off kind of thing every now and then.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of conversations about authorship that I think have been floating around, especially in the Persian filmmaking community. And I think it's just like there's such a history of other people telling our stories. And regardless of the good intentions, I still believe that right now we're in a place where we just need to be telling our stories. Like we haven't even had the chance to tell our stories. So it's like let us do it first before you come in and start like, you know, and I know a lot of people are in love with Persian culture, but like I said, there's I grew up Iranian and so many other people who grew up Iranian, even in Canada or the US, we had to hide who we were for like almost our entire lives until maybe more recently. And it on a personal level, I always feel a little bit, I get a little triggered, I guess, because I'm like, I had to really hide who I was. I wasn't even able to make films about being Persian until probably more recently, like so many other people. And then you see white people come in and just be like, and get awarded for it. It does trigger me. I'm gonna be honest, it does. And um yeah, I don't want, I don't like to single people out, but I'm also just like I also do want to speak on it because like you said, it needs to be like a broader conversation. Um and I just want more Persian people from especially from the diaspora to make stories about us because there's so many stories to tell. And I just prefer like, you know, we just need our time. We just need our time. So it's like, I would rather allies or fans of Persian culture kind of see what they can do to help us. Like I try to help other Persian filmmakers as much as I can, who maybe are making shorts or, doing docs and like Iranians around the world. The Iranian filmmakers are obviously some of the most respected filmmakers in terms of international cinema. But I think when it comes to diaspora filmmaking, with in terms of like Iranian American, Iranian British, Iranian Canadian films, there's not a lot of them, and I feel that we need our time to reclaim our narratives, because a lot of especially white male filmmakers have come in and like loved the culture and made films about the culture from their point of view. And the thing is, and I talk a lot about this with other Iranian filmmakers, is we grew up living in the bodies of being Iranian, and that's an undeniable experience that you cannot assume what that's like. It's very, and I mean that in like living in North America, growing up as a Middle Eastern person, especially in like a post 9/11 era, like I grew up in, because I'm an older millennial.
And which reflects in your movie in terms of post Vietnam as well. And you were talking about parallels to Motherland as well.
Yeah, I love thinking about my father and my own parallel with our identity, because he grew up in that kind of post revolution, post hostage crisis time, because he never went back to Iran. He just stayed in Canada from then on, and married my mom, a white woman, and kind of had to navigate his identity so much. Changed his name to Bob, like just went by Bob, like shaved his beard, did all the things that are in the movie, and then passed on those insecurities to me. And then I had to live in the sort of post 9/11 fear of like Islamophobic fear of Middle Eastern people time, the Bush years. And that's just that's such an experience that, even I think a lot of us, you see that with other Iranian filmmakers who are Iranian American. They might not have started making Iranian films about Iran at all until later in their life. And there's no accident for that, because that was not welcomed for so long. And if you're from Iran and you're going to Cannes to play a film and it's lauded, that's different. But if you've existed in this atmosphere, you're probably not going to think about making films about being Iranian until much later, when you realize, okay, maybe now is the time I can feel safe. So when a white uh, guy comes in and says, "Oh, I feel so comfortable, I can go to Iran and like absorb the culture," like I can't go to Iran. It's not safe for me. And my male filmmaker friends who are Iranian, they can't go. They'll be recruited to the army. They have to do mandatory military service, because
And
we are.
you even talked as well about, sorry to cut you off because I think this is
No.
really important. You even talked in other interviews about how, and I didn't even think about this, how friends of yours that are Iranian, they have to shave their beards when they're going to the airport, and like that in terms of assimilation again.
Oh, I know someone close to me who's Iranian. He last year, they, because of his name, they said you can't get on the plane. He works for a film company, so he didn't go. The rest of his crew went. He couldn't go. So it's triggering in the sense when there's other people come in and tell our stories, and they can just freely pass through borders. They can just walk in, absorb the parts of the culture that they like, the language, the food, the music, which is all beautiful, but they don't have to live the hard parts. And that to me is a broader discussion I think we just need to have in general about Middle Eastern filmmaking, because it happens with Arab films too all the time. So I think this is just I would love to have a broader conversation about it without, I'm not trying to single anyone out, but it is important
Yes.
to discuss.
Yeah, and I realize as a white man, like it's one of those things where like I don't know if I have like the complete capacity to understand it all, but I want to listen and try to understand more about it. And like even talking to you about it, like I just appreciate everything that you're talking about, because you just don't think about it in those terms. And I think a lot of people don't, because it's almost like you're a tourist in somebody else's world, and you'll never be able to experience it the way that they are. And like you have to have that like sensitivity and understanding just to know that you're not that person, and you are basically taking someone else's world and saying, I like this, and it's not just as simple as that.
Exactly, yeah. And I think there's some respect for it with other cultures, but for some reason with Middle Eastern uh, culture and filmmaking, there's either a complete ignorance to what our experience is, or a fascination with the pretty parts. And I'm like, you can't go and eat our food and then not understand our what's happened to us, over the centuries. It's like it's the same thing with, when you think about Palestine and eating the food and enjoying Arab culture but not standing up for them. So it's like I think this is something that is a collective feeling with Middle Eastern filmmaking, and I think it's just rising now, and it's um we just got to keep pushing and just keep making our films and taking up space, I think, more than
Absolutely. And even when you were, I keep referencing other interviews that you've done, but I think this is important as well because, we talked about this early on about the immigrant story. The first thing that you think of is something like The Godfather Part Two, when Vito Corleone comes to America, and that imagery is so strong, but it's always been from the perspective of the ethnic white. And, it's not simply it's almost like one experience. It's not every experience. And like I wanted to ask you as well, are there any Iranian films, immigrant films that capture that? Because I couldn't think of any off of the top of my head.
You know what? There's not many. And I think the reason for that is a lot of Iranians, there's even within our own community, there's so much divide over what stories should be told, how they should be, what is important, what's not important. The one that comes to mind more recently is this film called Shada, which was an Australian Iranian film executive produced by Kate Blanchett, and it played at TIFF. I think that's a really remarkable film. It follows like an Iranian woman with her daughter who's in an abusive relationship and also navigating trying to live in Australia. So I think that's the only one I can really think of, you know. Like I said, there's Little America, but it's a bit sanitized in terms of what I think the immigrant experience is. And I also think like I'm interested in like a more nuanced. I don't want all our immigrant stories to be doom and gloom, but I think that there's ways like I said, I always reference Minari because that's a beautiful immigrant story, I think, that looks at the nuances of what it's like to arrive in a new world, but also look at the joy of being a family in a new place together. I think both can coexist, but I think it's important to not sanitize it and to just look at all aspects of the experience and from all different points of view too, which I think we'll see. I think there's a lot of new shorts filmmakers who are Iranian that I've watched their films, and those are about the immigrant experience of being Iranian. And then as they grow, we'll see their features as well.
Absolutely. And that's exciting. Like it's always exciting when you see a new generation of filmmakers come in, and it's not just from one person either, to be put upon and feel like you are the one that's representing, one culture or one society. It's almost like it's on your shoulders in a way, but if you have a group of support, and colleagues in that way, I think it's important as well. But yeah, and going back to before, like I was reading some of your posts on Instagram, and you've been very transparent about the relationship that you had with your father, and I found that to be very you know not only honest, but like it was very relatable in the sense of where like I think there's a generational aspect where I think younger generations are opening up a little bit more to talk about what's bothering them and even wanting to know about their own history. And like I was reminded of like with my dad, I never really talked to him about because I always kind of resented him because he and my mom got divorced when I was a kid, and I started to make this so personal. But there was a part of him that I always resented for that. And, I saw myself in him, and there were things about him that I didn't like in myself, and vice versa. But even like learning about the horrors of history because he worked for the UN and was in Rwanda and Kosovo during the genocides, and he never talked about that stuff for the longest time. And it wasn't until recently that I've been kind of able to talk to him about that. And I kind of felt like even just talking to you, it's like I'm starting to feel more grateful that like, oh, I can actually now have this discussion and not regret it later on where you
Yes.
can't. So
Yeah, and encourage you to do it while they're still around because I'm like you. I have resentments towards my father too. I think like whatever trauma it's a lot of comes from trauma. Like his dad was murdered in Iran when he was young. And my grandfather was very political. He was a socialist. He was also a doctor who worked in the villages in Iran, and he cared about uh people he cared about everybody being okay. But, you know, the political agenda of the Shah at the time, and he was murdered at gunpoint in the 60s. So I understood, like, my dad carried this trauma his whole life, didn't go to therapy, and then had to raise kids, move to a new country, and you find empathy in that, I guess. Um, but it's complicated for us, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
complicated.
I mean, the dad, trauma or depression of it all, but it's also,
Yeah.
I think it's also like on you in terms of just how you feel about yourself and just trying to work out, the not the issues, but just trying to work on yourself to be better and want to feel whole in a way and not like you're holding yourself to a standard of the past. But it's hard to shake sometimes. So
Yeah. Yeah. And to not repeat the same things, like to be the one in the family that changes it
yeah,
and carries
absolutely.
it forward.
Well, Jasmine, I do have to wrap, but it was great talking to you, and I will. So the idea is that this will go up as both the podcast and for Rogers. I'll get in touch with Catherine again, but are there any EPK kit materials available, like just like stills or like a
Yes,
trailer? Okay, all
there's
right.
stills and a trailer.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So I'll request that because it just helps with like when it's for television, to give some sort
Yeah.
of visual component that it's not just talking heads for the whole
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Eric. This was really one of the best interviews I've ever done. So you're really great. And I
Th-
love your podcast is amazing. And good luck with everything. And thank you.
Well, thank you. And honestly, like Motherland is great and Firecrackers is excellent. And it's just like it's so exciting when you see like, this filmmaker who has a unique voice, but is continually, redefining it. And like I'm just so excited to see like your next feature and what's going to happen next. And it's just like again, like talking about, what Tracy Deer is doing and what Meredith Hama Brown, like it's so exciting to see what the future of not only Canadian cinema is, but just like what movies can stories can tell and so
Yeah,
yeah.
totally. I
All right,
appreciate
well,
it.
yeah, absolutely, and thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.